Electroculture. The method, the USDA buried in 1924. 1 copper wire, 200% more yield. In 1920, a French inventor named Justin Christofleau published documented field results showing yield increases of over 200% using nothing but copper wire antennas twisted into spiral coils and pushed into the soil. No fertilizer, no irrigation upgrades, no genetic modification. A copper wire. The United States Department of Agriculture reviewed his findings in 1924 and classified them. The research disappeared from public record for 50 years. The fertilizer industry was worth $12 billion by 1930. The timing is not a coincidence. Electroculture is the practice of using atmospheric electricity, the natural electromagnetic field that surrounds the Earth, to stimulate plant growth, increase nutrient uptake, and repel pests without chemicals. The concept is not fringe. The concept is not new. The first documented observations date to 1746, when French abbé and scientist Jean-Antoine Nollet noticed that plants growing in areas struck by lightning showed dramatically accelerated growth in the weeks following the strike. He spent 5 years documenting the pattern. The pattern held every time. The Earth carries a natural electrical charge. The atmosphere above it carries the opposite charge. Between them exists a voltage gradient of approximately 100 volts per meter, meaning that at 2 meters above ground, the electrical potential is 200 volts higher than at ground level. Plants are embedded in this field. Their root systems extend into the negatively charged earth. Their stems and leaves project into the positively charged atmosphere. Every plant on this planet is already functioning as a biological antenna. Electroculture does not introduce something foreign. It amplifies something already happening. Justin Christofleau was not a mystic. He was an engineer. Born in 1870 in Bordeaux, he spent 2 decades working in agricultural engineering before turning his attention to what he called electromagnetic stimulation of plant growth. His 1920 book, Electroculture, documented field experiments conducted across multiple growing seasons on wheat, barley, oats, potatoes, and sugar beets. His yield data was consistent. Plants grown near copper spiral antennas produced between 40 and 230% more than control plots. His methodology was repeatable. Other French farmers replicated it. The results held. Christofleau's copper spiral antenna is deceptively simple. Take a length of pure copper wire, 99.9% copper, not coated, not insulated. Twist it into a clockwise spiral coil following the same rotational direction as the Coriolis force in the northern hemisphere. Drive a wooden stake into the soil and wind the coil around it so that it rises from ground level upward, acting as a vertical conductor. The coil collects atmospheric electricity at its top and channels it downward through the stake and into the root zone of the surrounding plants. That is the entire mechanism. It costs under $5 to build. The science behind why this works involves the movement of ions in the soil. Plant roots absorb nutrients through a process called electroosmosis, the movement of water and dissolved minerals through cell membranes driven by electrical potential differences. When the electrical gradient in the soil is increased, even slightly, ion transport accelerates. Nutrients that would normally take days to reach the root tip arrive in hours. The plant does not work harder. The delivery system becomes more efficient. Christofleau understood this in 1920. The mechanism was confirmed by soil electrochemistry research in the 1970s. The application was never approved for commercial use. Christofleau was not alone. In the same decade, Austrian forester and water scientist Viktor Schauberger was documenting how the electromagnetic properties of natural water movement, specifically the spiral vortex patterns of undisturbed streams, produced measurable growth acceleration in plants irrigated with vortex-structured water. Schauberger's work was seized by the Nazi regime in 1941, and later by American intelligence after the war. His laboratory was dismantled. His notes were confiscated. He died in 1958, 5 days after signing a contract with an American corporation, reportedly in profound distress about what had been taken from him. In 1918, British scientist Lemstrom published detailed field reports from experiments conducted in Scandinavia showing that plants grown under electrified wire grids that mimicked the static charge of the atmosphere during auroral events, produced yields between 20 and 70% higher than controls. His work was published in peer-reviewed journals. It was cited by Christofleau. It was reviewed by agricultural departments across Europe. And then, as synthetic fertilizer became commercially available at scale after World War I, and the nitrogen fixation process was weaponized into a product, the research funding for atmospheric agriculture dried up completely within a single decade. The fertilizer industry traces directly to the Haber-Bosch process, a method for synthesizing nitrogen fertilizer from atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen, developed by Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch at BASF in Germany between 1909 and 1913. The same process that fed the world also produced the ammonia for German munitions in World War I. After the war, the industrial infrastructure built for weapons production needed a civilian market. Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer became that market. By 1925, it was the fastest growing segment of the global chemical industry. Any agricultural method that made fertilizer unnecessary was a direct threat to that market. The USDA review of Christofleau's work in 1924 was not a scientific rejection. The review was never published. No refutation study was conducted. No controlled trial was organized to disprove his results. The findings were simply not forwarded for further development. They were reviewed, noted, and filed. The bureaucratic mechanism of suppression is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a filing cabinet. Sometimes it is a budget allocation that never comes. Sometimes it is the absence of a follow-up. Christofleau's documented 200% yield increases received no follow-up from any American agricultural institution for the next 40 years. The modern fertilizer industry is worth over $200 billion annually. The global pesticide market adds another $85 billion. Together, the chemical inputs that define industrial agriculture represent the largest recurring cost in food production worldwide. A farmer using electroculture antennas and no synthetic inputs is not just growing differently. They are opting out of a supply chain worth nearly $300 billion per year. That is not a niche decision. That is an economic threat to one of the most powerful industries in human history. The scale of the threat explains the scale of the institutional silence. In 1969, a researcher named Phillip Callahan at the University of Florida began publishing work on what he called paramagnetism, the weak magnetic properties of volcanic rock and certain soils, and its relationship to plant health and growth. Callahan documented that soils with high paramagnetic properties produced healthier, more disease-resistant crops. He connected his findings to ancient agricultural traditions, the Irish practice of spreading volcanic rock dust on fields, the Japanese use of paramagnetic soil amendments going back centuries. His work was published. It was not funded. He retired without a successor. His books are out of print. Callahan also documented the antenna-like structures of insect antennae and plant stems, showing through infrared spectroscopy that both were tuned to receive specific electromagnetic frequencies in the far infrared range, the same frequencies emitted by healthy soil. His hypothesis was that plant health was partly a function of electromagnetic communication between soil, root, and atmosphere, and that disrupting that communication through chemical inputs and electromagnetic pollution was a direct cause of crop vulnerability to pests and disease. He was not asked to continue the research. The USDA did not respond to his findings. The copper in electroculture antennas is not arbitrary. Copper is the second most electrically conductive metal after silver, and unlike silver, it does not oxidize in a way that disrupts conductivity. Copper oxide is itself a semiconductor. Copper also has a long agricultural history independent of electroculture. Copper sulfate has been used as a fungicide since the 1880s. Biodynamic farmers use copper preparations as soil amendments. The Romans planted in copper-rich volcanic soils. The convergence of copper and agricultural success across unconnected traditions is not coincidence. It is chemistry arriving at the same conclusion independently. Modern research on bioelectricity in plants has confirmed what Christofleau documented empirically. A 2013 study published in Plant Signaling and Behavior demonstrated that plants use electrical signals to communicate stress responses between cells, the equivalent of a nervous system response. A 2020 study in Nature documented real-time electrical signaling in plants in response to environmental stimuli, with signals propagating through the plant at measurable speeds. The electrical nature of plant biology is now peer-reviewed and uncontested. The question of whether external electrical inputs affect that biology is one that has not been funded for research. That absence of funding is itself data. In 2022, electroculture became one of the fastest growing search trends in home gardening. The term accumulated over 200 million views on TikTok within 12 months. Thousands of home gardeners began posting results. Tomatoes growing to double their expected size, pepper plants producing continuously through seasons when they should have slowed, root vegetables with yields their growers described as impossible. None of this constitutes clinical evidence. All of it constitutes a pattern. The pattern is the same pattern Christofleau documented in 1920. 100 years later, people with copper wire and no agricultural budget are arriving at the same place. The most common electroculture setup requires 3 things: pure copper wire, a wooden stake, and 10 minutes. Wind the wire clockwise around the stake in a spiral, starting at the bottom and ending at a point above the height of your plants. Drive the stake into the center or perimeter of your growing area. Leave the top of the coil exposed to the open sky. That is the antenna end, the point of collection. The bottom of the stake contacts the soil. That is the ground end, the point of discharge. The coil between them is the conductor. You have built what Christofleau built in 1920. The materials cost under $5. The direction of the spiral matters according to Christofleau and most modern practitioners. In the northern hemisphere, wind clockwise when viewed from above, following the same direction as the Coriolis rotation of weather systems. In the southern hemisphere, reverse it. The reasoning is that the antenna should align with the natural rotational field of the atmosphere above it, maximizing coherence between the coil's electromagnetic orientation and the ambient field it is designed to collect. This is consistent with how directional antennas work in radio engineering. The physics is the same. The application is food instead of signal. Beyond copper spirals, electroculture practitioners use several other methods documented by Christofleau and expanded by later researchers. Wooden dowels wrapped with copper wire and driven into the ground at the corners of a garden bed create a rectangular field effect. Copper pipes driven vertically into the soil act as ground rods, conducting atmospheric charge into the root zone passively. Paramagnetic rock dust, specifically basalt dust, spread on soil surfaces increases the soil's ability to hold and conduct electromagnetic charge. Each method addresses the same mechanism from a different angle. Increase the electrical conductivity and gradient in the plant's immediate environment. The relationship between copper antennas and pest reduction is one of the most consistently reported outcomes in modern electroculture practice and one of the least explained by conventional science. Christofleau documented it. Modern practitioners report it repeatedly. The most plausible mechanism involves the same electromagnetic communication system that Callahan documented. Pest insects locate host plants partly through infrared and electromagnetic signatures. A plant growing in a modified electromagnetic environment may emit a different signature, one that is either less detectable or actively repellent to certain insects. The research to confirm or deny this has not been conducted. The pesticide industry has not funded it. There is a straightforward economic argument for electroculture that has nothing to do with suppression or conspiracy. A copper spiral antenna costs under $5 and lasts indefinitely. A season's supply of synthetic fertilizer for a home garden costs between $40 and $200 and must be repurchased every year. A season's supply of pesticides adds another $20 to $100. Over 10 years, the difference between a gardener using electroculture and one using conventional inputs is between $600 and $3,000. Multiply that by the 166 million home gardeners in the United States, and the number becomes a market disruption large enough to explain institutional disinterest. The wooden stake is not decorative. Wood is a natural dielectric. It does not conduct electricity itself, but it holds and orients the copper coil in a stable position relative to the soil. The grain structure of wood also has a natural directionality that some practitioners believe amplifies the coherence of the coil's field. Bamboo is the most commonly recommended material. Its silica content and cellular structure make it particularly stable in soil, and it does not rot at the rate of softer woods. Hazel and willow have traditional use in dowsing and water finding going back centuries, and both have been used as stakes in electroculture with reported good results. Water plays a role in electroculture that Christofleau documented, but modern practitioners have expanded significantly. Water that has been vortexed, spun in a spiral before being applied to soil, appears to increase plant uptake rates and soil conductivity. The mechanism proposed by Schauberger and later by Marcel Violet, a French researcher in the 1950s, involves the crystalline structure of water molecules and their ability to carry and transmit electrical information. Violet conducted experiments with vortexed water on wheat crops and documented consistent yield increases. His work was published in France and ignored everywhere else. The vortex water research was never replicated by any agricultural institution. Full-scale electroculture implementation for a backyard garden of 100 square feet requires approximately 4 copper spiral antennas placed at the corners, 1 central antenna at the highest point of the space, and optional copper wire run along the perimeter at ground level, connecting the corner antennas into a closed circuit. Total materials cost, under $30. Total installation time, under 2 hours. Maintenance, none. The system operates passively for the lifetime of the copper, decades, potentially longer. The ongoing cost of the most effective agricultural yield enhancement method documented in the 20th century is functionally zero. Moon phase planting, the practice of timing sowing and harvest to lunar cycles, appears in Christofleau's work as a companion to electroculture. The mechanism is electromagnetic. The moon's gravitational pull affects not just ocean tides, but the movement of water in soil, and the moon's position relative to Earth affects the ambient electromagnetic field in measurable ways. Biodynamic agriculture, developed by Rudolf Steiner in 1924, the same year Christofleau's work was filed and forgotten by the USDA, encodes lunar timing into a comprehensive planting calendar. Farmers using biodynamic methods consistently report results that conventional agriculture cannot explain. They are using the same force Christofleau was using. They are calling it something different. The suppression of electroculture was not a single event. It was a gradient, a slow withdrawal of attention, funding, and institutional legitimacy over several decades. The BASF Corporation, which held the patents on the Haber-Bosch fertilizer process, had direct relationships with agricultural research institutions in Europe and the United States through the 1920s and 1930s. The concept of industry-funded research shaping what questions get asked and what findings get published is not controversial in 2024. It is documented. What is less documented is how many agricultural methods that threatened chemical dependency were quietly set aside during the period when chemical agriculture was establishing its dominance. You do not need a farm. You do not need land. You do not need a budget. A single copper spiral antenna in a container of tomatoes on a balcony costs $4.30. If it works for you, if your plants grow faster, produce more, resist pests better, you will have replicated what Christofleau documented in 1920, what Lemstrom documented in 1918, what thousands of TikTok gardeners documented in 2022. If it does not work, you have lost $4. The asymmetry of that experiment should be enough to make anyone curious. The fact that it is not taught in any agricultural school should make you ask why. The revival of electroculture is happening through the same channels as the revival of every suppressed agricultural method: YouTube, TikTok, homesteading blogs, and the direct transmission of knowledge between people who tried something, saw results, and told someone else. The institutions that ignored it for 100 years are still ignoring it. The peer-reviewed research that would settle the question has not been funded. The farmers and gardeners who are getting results do not need the research to be funded. They have the results. The knowledge does not require institutional permission to exist. It requires only that someone try it. Justin Christofleau died in 1933 without seeing his work validated by the institutions that had the power to validate it. Viktor Schauberger died in 1958 having watched his life's work confiscated twice. Phillip Callahan retired in obscurity. The pattern is consistent. When agricultural research threatens chemical dependency, the researcher's career ends, and the research is not continued. The knowledge survives because it was published before it could be stopped, because it was replicated by farmers before the replication could be discouraged, and because the underlying physics does not require anyone's permission to operate. The copper spiral in your garden does not know it was suppressed. It just works. The Haber-Bosch fertilizer process has been called the most important invention of the 20th century because it enabled the feeding of a human population that could not have been fed by organic agriculture alone, or so the argument goes. That argument has never been tested against a world in which electroculture was developed rather than suppressed. We do not know what 100 years of funded electroculture research would have produced. We know only what 100 years of funded fertilizer research produced. A $200 billion industry, soil that is losing biological diversity at measurable rates, and a global food system entirely dependent on chemical inputs that are themselves dependent on fossil fuels. Christofleau offered a different path in 1920. The path was not taken. It is still there. If you have a garden, even a single pot on a windowsill, try this. $4 of copper wire, 1 wooden stake, 30 minutes. Share this with someone who grows anything. Check the link in the description for the copper wire and materials if you want to start this week. And subscribe. Every video on this channel covers one more method they made sure you would never learn in school.